Sean, you were asking, is this a little bit lengthier than like what a typical one would be? And yes, because as I said, I think like the longest rhetorical analysis that I recall that showed up on recent AP exams is around 120, which is still kind of lengthy. If you do get a longer response or a longer passage, that's not a bad thing necessarily, because if anything, it gives you more stuff to pull from. You wouldn't be expected to write a lengthier essay, but it might be easier to pull a couple of devices, 2 or 3 from 120 lines, 130, as opposed to like 75 or 80, since it gives you just a few more, ideas to pull from. I don't think from a reading standpoint it would make things too much more difficult. All right, so remember the rules with soapstone. Speaker, we don't want to simply put Booker T. Washington, because we want more like abstract concepts that could be used to describe them. We don't have to start with speaker, but for any of those things, any ideas coming to mind, probably speaker, occasion, audience are going to be the more straightforward ones, and then the other ones get a little bit more interpretive, but any of those that we know for sure. Yep. And like African American male, and with that you could go advocate. He is in a sense politician. He has a lot of political ties. He's very well networked, especially with northern whites, and that's helping with endowment of Tuskegee Institute partnerships, things like that, and also certainly educator. Anything else for speaker? Former slave could, be significant depending on some of the details that you take a look at. Certainly freed now, but history of slavery.
Innovator?
Yeah, innovator, sure. Kind of put that up here with advocate. All right. Occasion audience. Remember, occasion's basically time, setting, all that kind of stuff. Prompt tells us a couple things so far as occasion. We know the when and where. What's the when? 1895. And the where is Atlanta. 1895 mean anything context-wise of issue that would be going on? I mean, you're dealing with race relations to an extent.
We're like around the tail end of Reconstruction, getting into the Progressive era. I think we're like smack dab in the Gilded Age as well.
So the hope would be if you're going from Reconstruction into Progressive era, that maybe some change is starting to go, move forward. At the same time, if you look at it historically, the next year, 1896, is when the Supreme Court does the ruling on Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is right before segregation is essentially made legal or gets the legal approval from the Supreme Court. But yeah, you're in that post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, pre-Civil Rights movement where you're still dealing with a whole lot of Jim Crow issues, especially in the South, that is making progress pretty difficult at this point. Audience, we were kind of mentioning, a couple things, telling you that for the most part you're going to have a predominantly upper-class white audience. Based on the speech, do we know anyone in the audience? I mean, he basically says, "Hi, Mr. President." He's there. President 1895?
I thought it was the president of the committee.
No, he's when he mentions Mr. President and directors, the directors would be the folks basically in charge. But this is at the beginning. Cleveland is there. Grover Cleveland is president at the time. He is there, and he being Booker T. Washington is well networked. This would not be like the first time they've ever met or seen people. But you have political leaders. You have industrial leaders.
Is the city of Cleveland named after him?
No.
I didn't think so.
Half the time I call him Grover Cleveland Alexander. Do you know who that is?
No idea.
He was a pitcher. He's in the Hall of Fame. He won 373 games. Who's counting? But I think of him before I think of the president.
My brother's named after a baseball player.
Well, I mean, Grover Cleveland did
Nolan
do
Ryan.
writing.
Wait, isn't it the same Ryan?
And your audience, the turnstile count throughout the Atlanta exposition is roughly 800,000 people. Now, it's not saying he is speaking to all 800,000 right then and there, but this is a big deal that you have a lot of folks present. Purpose and subject, I think, is where things get a little cloudy.
I put purpose to compromise.
Du Bois would agree with you. And Du Bois being the author of the other packet that we'll take a look at a little bit later. Compromise what? Like if we were to follow up with a subject.
Like the treatment that whites want for blacks want, like to be.
So compromise the wants, needs of both blacks and whites.
Yeah.
Okay. Annalise?
I was gonna say, I thought the purpose was like to encourage the progress that they already made.
Okay,
Like,
so.
encourage it to keep going.
And I'm going to kind of steal a phrase from his speech, but kind of like encourage that mutual progress.
Yeah.
Okay. And really, the nice thing about these two responses would be proponents of the speech, and not saying they're the only two options by any means. And Byron, do you have one too?
I was gonna say like director guy.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. Proponents of the speech, I think, would go, yep, he's encouraging. Mutual progress, this will benefit all parties. Those that tend to look at the speech more in a negative light, and Du Bois is the one who comes up with the term Atlanta Compromise in 1903 within the publication that you have, would look at it as, you're giving up a whole heck of a lot, or you're not asking for a whole lot just to keep white people happy. Isn't it time that we try to even that scale a little bit? So the problem that gets caused with the speech from a historical standpoint, big divide between those two camps, and certainly I think the tone kind of has part of that. Now, what was the term that you mentioned?
Director
Director guide. Any particular audience or?
guy. Well, he's guiding. I think like he's giving a direction for where the compromise should go, or where, like, we're talking about reconstruction. Like, what's our goal? What are we trying to do?
So kind of and I'm not trying to take the cast down your bucket approach, but kind of guide us through the waters here that are a little murky at this point, and try to maybe find some kind of peace, not necessarily in the sense of Martin Luther King, but like some reconciliation, calm everyone down, and
Well,
make this
just
kind of
like,
beneficial.
This will bring a new heaven.
So from a tone standpoint, that would make it sound kind of.
Optimistic.
I said,
What did you say?
I said pleading.
Pleading.
I just have a question. At this time period, were blacks the only non-white people going through tough times, or like
No, well-
Asians, everybody remained?
It's going to be regional. West Coast, you're going to have more of an influx because at this point, railways are pretty much exploding everywhere. So you have a lot of exploitation taking place of Asians, more West Coast. It's going to depend where you are. Like if you're on eastern side, European immigrants coming in. Certainly within the South, it's going to be main issue with African Americans. And I couldn't give you a number standpoint, but what's a specific detail, numeric detail that Washington gives us? We're talking about what percentage of the population? 1/3, and then he gives us the number of 8 million or 16 million hands. So it's certainly not probably, the largest group that we would be looking at, and certainly the one that has the most history behind it. Noel, did you have another? Submissive. And again, I think if you take a look at the purposes, that compromise, probably the submissive term is going to go more with there. The encourage might be more of that kind of optimistic approach that would take place. I think as we take a look then at the speech itself, both of these you can certainly get some merit for. what are some particular devices that you took note of? I think there's one that's pretty much in your face that I'm thinking everyone highlighted. Doesn't mean we have to start with that one, but you said repetition
Yeah.
of,
The cast on your bucket reference.
okay. And some folks, you could put repetition for it. I could see others going analogy or extended metaphor. So it doesn't mean that necessarily it would have to be the same term. Cast down your bucket. Who's supposed to cast down their bucket?
White people.
Who?
White people.
How come?
Well, more like white business owners and farmers. Like they are asking for a chance to work with them and stuff. So
Okay. So really, the answer ends up kind of being, honestly, both. Where if you take a look here at line 62, to those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongues, I would say cast down your bucket where you are. Over where he brings it up initially, to those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land or underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man, I would say cast down your bucket where you are. So if you take a look at the prompt, analyze the devices used in Washington's appeal to both southern whites and blacks, certainly the repetition or the analogy of cast down your bucket would work because that is going to both. What are one of the perks, and I'm thinking more second column, that Washington highlights to whites as to why you should cast down your bucket?
We'll be faithful.
Okay. And when you take a look at the, around line 80?
Yeah,
80, yeah. Most patient, faithful, law-abiding, unresentful people that the world has seen. Take a look now here at 83. We have proved our loyalty to you in the past in nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them in tearful dimmed eyes to their graves. What's he talking about? And up at the top, he also makes reference to we should not permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. Essentially, right there, you're taking a look at slavery as well. So from that tone standpoint, if you were looking at submissive diction, now some might go tactful diction, so that he's not, causing any kind of issues with it. You could also even use a term like euphemism, where remember you use a term that is more pleasant than actuality. He doesn't make reference to we proved our worthiness to you in slavery, but he does kind of a positive connotation and look at the kind of people that we are, where we have proved ourselves through loyalty. Now you could argue that he's kind of doing some rosy-colored lenses here, trying to make it kind of sound off better than it was. You could kind of switch and go, we've proved ourselves through this, we're still here, we're not out to get you. I think we've earned the right to maybe try to promote and cultivate some economic value that would work for both of us. But it's very easy to see how someone could take a look at, you mentioned grievances and loyalty, and that's really us dealing with slavery. That might not come across too well to some parties. How does he follow this up once you get to like the lines 91 through 94? In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. What is he essentially, I don't want to say recommending, but what's he certainly acknowledging at that point? We can be as separate as the figures when it comes, so if we're talking about riding on trains, we're talking about where we live, we're talking about the institutions that we go to, we can be separate, but for economic mutual progress, we're going to be one hand. Again, the rosy, lenses, you could go, well, that sounds good, that there's going to be mutual progress for everyone, but it's still going to allow that institution of segregation to exist. So you will absolutely get a lot of folks who are going to be upset with this idea, where it almost seems, I don't want to say that he's advocating for it, but you could argue certainly condoning segregation so long as this does allow for economic progress. Arguments would be if you allow segregation to occur socially, what's essentially going to ultimately happen economically? It's probably going to carry over. Even at that point, where does he talk about where we must begin our lives? Again, we going African Americans.
We just start at the bottom.
In ignorance and inexperience, it is not strange to ask to stop at the top, but he mentions that we will begin at the bottom, work our way up. So even with that, you're certainly getting some submissive kind of diction taking place, and he's doing that up here at around that line 60. At the bottom, we must begin. So it's not just an isolated speech we're taking a look at. One of the things while we go through Invisible Man, how does this kind of work its way into the book? I think it will be pretty straightforward by the time we get to the end of chapter 1.
Mr. Kenny, you ever heard the song?
Keep the speech with you because we need it for tomorrow, so make sure you have it with you.
You ever heard the song Shaker or something?
I have not.
Oh, it's so good. Because it's time to start shaking your